Every year I put together a video taking a look at all of the currently in development MMOs we have to look forward to. In fact, it's become almost a running joke, the number of games that seem to be perpetually on this list year after year, some of which boasting development times of nearly a decade at this point. Well, I got some bad news here. We can all stop laughing at the joke. This list just got a heck of a lot shorter. Over the past few months, 4 in development MMOs that I've been looking forward to have been canceled. Four projects, and these weren't just like tiny little barely funded games. No, these were some fairly big deals as far as I'm concerned. Pretty much all of the games on this list were somewhere near the top of the upcoming MMOs that I'm looking forward to playing, me personally. There's some pretty big names here that just completely got the axe this year. It's almost unbelievable, and I think just really speaks to the current state of things for MMO fans. If you're someone like me who looks forward to checking out new games and having new experiences in this genre, it's really not looking great out there. It simply is not. So most recently, like just a couple of weeks ago, it was revealed that the Warhammer MMO being developed by Jackalyptic Games had been canceled as a result of their partnership with NetEase abruptly coming to an end. Now, we first learned about this game back in 2023, being developed by Jackalyptic, a fresh studio founded by Jack Emmert, who's probably best known as the lead designer on both City of Heroes and City of Villains. This Warhammer MMO was going to be this studio's first major project, of which Emmert said, "As someone who has molded my career developing expansive MMO stories, I'm proud to unveil that our first game in development at Jackalyptic Games will focus on the rich universes of Warhammer. Bringing the deep lore of this IP to our game is a massive undertaking, and we are thrilled to work alongside Games Workshop to bring this vision to life." So they'd been working closely with Games Workshop and had a lot of plans for the MMO. Following the initial reveal, Emmert had gone on a bit of a interview tour, sharing some details. He said the team of developers working on the game had loads of MMO experience, some of which included prior members of Daybreak Games who had ended up following Emmert onto his next project. They intended to stay true to the Warhammer IP, although at the time it hadn't been specified if this was 40k, fantasy, or otherwise, just that it was in the Warhammer umbrella. The game would have action combat as well, as opposed to the old school style of tab targeting. There would be support for user-generated content, something they had done with prior games, including both Neverwinter and Star Trek Online, and it was said to be a PC-centric game. Even though they had been partnering with NetEase, they said that there was, quote, "no pressure or suggestion that we should have to do mobile," although now that we know how that's ended, I don't know, maybe they should have announced they were going to do mobile so NetEase wouldn't have canceled the thing. Yeah, earlier this month, on Friday, November 7th specifically, Jack Emmert posted, "I'm here to share a note that after nearly 3.5 years working with NetEase as a first-party studio, our partnership will be coming to an end," going on to add that their team would be exploring new opportunities, or in other words, everybody's looking for a job because Jackalyptic has been canceled or closed down, and this Warhammer MMO, it will never see the light of day. Prior to the Warhammer MMO's cancellation, back in October, Project Ghost, in development by Fantastic Pixel Castle, was also canceled as a result of NetEase pulling their funding. What's probably most interesting about this game is that it had an incredibly open development, with the studio routinely sharing progress reports, developer blogs, screenshots, and even a lot of early gameplay. In fact, not too long ago, they had several content creators get hands-on time with the game. There are videos here on YouTube right now by the likes of Co-Carnage and Josh Strife Hayes and others, where you can see like hours of raw gameplay of this thing. It certainly had a ways to go, but there were some interesting ideas here. They would be supporting traditional fantasy roles with tanking, healing, and damage dealers. The game would be divided into multiple zone types. You'd have blue zones and red zones. One of these would be more like a survival crafting experience with some procedural generation, whereas the other would be more akin to a traditional MMORPG open world zones with handcrafted locations. Visually, yes, the game was full of placeholders, but concept and design-wise, it definitely showed a lot of promise. Last month, on October 9th, Greg Street, the head of Fantastic Pixel Castle, posted this announcement. "I wanted to share the news that Fantastic Pixel Castle's time as a first-party studio studio within NetEase Games is coming to an end. NetEase Games has been very gracious and supportive of looking for another publisher for our game. However, in the current market environment, very few deals are getting made for any game, let alone something on the scale of an MMORPG. Now, he did go on to say that they would be continuing to search for new publishers and investors with the hopes of keeping the studio alive and reviving the project. This unfortunately did not happen, and as of this week, on November 17th, Fantastic Pixel Castle has shuttered its doors, and unless some miracle happens in the coming weeks and months, Project Ghost will likely forever remain a specter. Also, this past October, we had Amazon announce that they would be scaling back their games division with the intent to fully exit any and all MMO development. So with this, they revealed plans to halt production for any further future content in New World. The game's servers will be remaining online for the time being, but no new content or updates will be coming, so its shutdown is just a matter of when, not if. What's more, though, is that the new Lord of the Rings MMO that they had in development, that has been canceled again. The attempt at making a new Lord of the Rings MMORPG beyond the existing Lord of the Rings Online has been seemingly cursed. I guess we'll blame Sauron for this one. I don't know, dude. Now, this actually dates all the way back to the summer of 2019 when Amazon first came out to announce they had entered into an agreement to develop an MMO based on the franchise. During this reveal, they said that they had a lot of industry veterans working on the title, people who had worked on World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Rift, Destiny, and Defiance. They wanted to make this engrossing new AAA experience set at a time long before the Lord of the Rings trilogy, exploring lands, people, and creatures never before seen. Now, the game's development had been going along. Again, we first heard about it in 2019. Development was going on, and then kind of out of the blue, even though we had reports that development was going fine, in early 2021, Amazon announced that the Lord of the Rings MMO was canceled. This was because what happened was in late 2020, the company that they were co-developing the game with, they were partnered with Leiyu Technologies. They had been purchased by Tencent, and then after that purchase, Amazon and Tencent went into contract negotiations, but because they failed to come to any agreement between the two parties, the game got the axe. And then a couple of years later, in 2023, they re-announced plans for a new, different Lord of the Rings MMO. This time, they would be cutting out the middleman and working directly with Middle-earth Enterprises, having full control to make exactly the MMO they wanted, as they would be doing it at their in-house Amazon Game Studios. Clearly, that didn't last very long, because here we are a couple of years later, and then this past October, the game once again has received the axe. At least this time, it was their decision, right? I guess I don't freaking know, dude. And then the last game on this list of sacked MMOs that I was looking forward to is Blackbird. And this one, honestly, I think stings the most. So back in July, as part of a massive round of layoffs you may have heard about, Microsoft cutting thousands of jobs, much of which impacted their games division, and in the process, Project Blackbird was canceled. This was a new MMO in development at ZeniMax Online Studios, creators of the Elder Scrolls Online. Now, first off, I just want to say here, I really like Elder Scrolls Online. It's not a perfect game, but there is a lot about it that I love, and I have gotten many hundreds of hours of entertainment out of this game over the years. In fact, I would probably say it's a top 5 MMO for me. It would probably be like World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, ESO, Star Wars The Old Republic, and ESO. Like a rough list. Plus or minus some games, you know what I mean? But it's 100% in the top 10, and I really do feel ESO is like top 5. Like games I've played the most, got the most entertainment out of, have worlds that I've really enjoyed exploring and content that I've enjoyed engaging with. ESO is up there. It's got flaws, but it's definitely up there for me if I'm listing them out. I, at the least, certainly have liked it well enough that I was super interested in seeing on what they were going to be working on next. Project Blackbird had been in production for nearly 7 years, and by all accounts, it was actually sounding like something that I could have loved. A few quotes to sum up the game here as follows. It was a blending of Destiny, Blade Runner, and Horizon Zero Dawn. Players would take up the role of revenants aligned with one of 5 different factions to explore the planet of Soteria, which has one side scorched by this endless sun and another side covered in darkness and ice, with a habitable zone in between known as the Twilight Band, and this whole continent wrapped up in the shooter MMO package. Blackbird was a third-person online looter shooter not too unlike Destiny, set within a new franchise. It had the sci-fi noir aesthetic, similar to films like Blade Runner, and had placed a lot of emphasis on vertical movement. Now, multiple sources who worked worked on the project have shared details about the game in the ensuing months. It was said to be a fully open world with a mix of biomes, visually diverse locations, points of interest, and then a major city known as Exodus. This was supposed to be some actually like massive elaborate zone into and of itself, located smack in the center of the game's world, referred to as a mega city with many vertical layers, hidden secrets, and mysteries within. And then on either side of the city, as you go out from the habitable twilight band in the middle, you would head towards those extreme ends. So it maybe be like lush forest and jungles in the middle, and then towards one end, towards that burning sun, it would get more deserty and hotter. Towards the other end, it would get cooler and more tundra-like until it eventually became a barren cold area. You'd have a hot area and a cold area, and then warmer and better stuff in the middle with the big mega city right smack in the middle. And that city was like a zone, completely huge, massive, explorable. There would be a big emphasis on traversal. Players could use abilities like double jumping, air dashing, and a grappling hook, and wall climbing to kind of fling yourself around tall buildings like superheroes. Something that I really liked in Dune Awakening, I think, is a great example of like traversal systems kind of flying around the environment. So I envisioned that could have been really cool. For characters and classes, they had planned detailed customizations with sculpting your body, adding scars, tattoos, biomods, and cybernetics. They would have a traditional Holy Trinity MMO system, tanky guns for hire, damage dealers, environmental controlling tech operators, and then healers known as augments. And then for content-wise, they plan to have questing for both solo and 4-player group missions. Besides exploring, you would take on basic quests, sending you out into the world to complete objectives and collect rewards. There were more difficult strike missions that would take up to 6 players to complete. They had large public events called firefights where players would dynamically come together to take on these larger threats. There are also plans for a housing system and PvP, although much like the Elder Scrolls Online, Blackbird would primarily focus on co-op gameplay and shared world environments, modifying various weapons and customizing your own apartments, vehicles, and drones. And they said it would be kind of similar to Bethesda RPGs with some of the dialogue options and stuff, although the team was aiming to try to make it more accessible along the lines of Destiny, while also being dynamic like Warframe and having a mysterious world, something akin to Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, I think what's most interesting about this game, though, is that by all accounts it was coming along nicely, and the people who played it, including Xbox executives, were pretty impressed, having like nothing but complimentary words for the project. In fact, it was reportedly said that Phil Spencer was enjoying his time trying the game so much they had to physically pull the controller away from him to continue their important business meetings, and this was according to 2 people who were in the room at the time. Also, Schreier reported having seen a vertical slice of the game, saying that he was impressed. It was slick looking with alluring visuals and interesting battle sequences. Nevertheless, despite the positive impressions and the game's development seemingly going well, Microsoft officially canceled Project Blackbird this past July. Now, when it comes to all of these canceled projects, between Microsoft canceling Blackbird, Amazon canceling their Lord of the Rings MMO, and then NetEase pulling funding out of the Project Ghost, as well as the Warhammer MMO. It all comes down to money. It's literally like an opportunity cost thing. They say, hey, we can invest however many hundreds of $millions in this project, this MMO, and it's gonna make some money, but will it make the most money? Like, if I'm gonna spend $500 million in Project Blackbird, would I be better suited spending that $500 million elsewhere? And that's essentially what these companies decide when they end up canceling projects like this. It's all a matter of opportunity cost. In fact, it is reportedly the case that in canceling Project Blackbird, that then allowed them to greenlight the next Fallout game. That was Microsoft's decision. They're like, you know what, we're going to stop supporting Project Blackbird, and we're just going to greenlight development for the next Fallout game from Bethesda proper. They're connected. There's the ZeniMax Online Studios makes the MMO, but then there's the umbrella ZeniMax company, and then there's Bethesda underneath that as well. So they're connected, and all of that got purchased by Microsoft at one point, as I'm sure you're familiar. And yeah, freaking sucks, dude, as a fan of MMOs. Now, circling back to that Warhammer MMO, during his interviews, Jack Emmert actually discussed what is pretty clearly a market desire for good new games in the genre that isn't being fulfilled, saying that after World of Warcraft, people tried to copy World of Warcraft, and in doing so, they tried to compete with World of Warcraft, which means investing a lot of money, which then requires a lot of profit. It required a massive success bigger than Warcraft. And when they didn't achieve that, because of course they didn't. World of Warcraft was one of a kind. Most of the major publishers just gave up on MMOs. To this day, we live in a world where in the West there are very few new MMOs. He went on to add, so from the perspective of the genre, I would say there is still demand. New World came out and quadrillions of copies were sold, well above 10 million, which is amazing, which tells me that there are people who want to play an MMO, but there's nobody making them. Well, there's certainly nobody making them anymore. I mean, like literally 4 of the ones that I was most looking forward to when we talk about IPs, the studios that they're coming from, just conceptually how these games were being put. I was genuinely looking forward to each of these. I love Warhammer as a franchise and an IP. I'm not the biggest Warhammer nerd, but every Warhammer video game that I played, I've always been like, this is such a cool world and a setting, and it would make for an awesome MMO. And there have been Warhammer MMOs. There's the Warhammer Age of Reckoning, which we had the history of and has seen a resurgence in recent years. And in fact, there was also a Warhammer Dark Millennium. There was a Warhammer 40K MMO that was almost released, but ended up getting canceled many years ago. And I would have loved to see a new Warhammer MMO. I play something like Space Marine, I play something like Dark Tide, I play something like Vermintide, and I'm like, dude, with modern graphics, the Warhammer setting would make a kick-ass place for an MMORPG. We had that in development, that got canceled. Of course, Project Ghost coming out of Ghostcrawler, although visually what was showcased, there wasn't much there to kind of draw you in, right? But conceptually, the things they were talking about, and from those hands-on impressions from the like of Co-Carnage and Josh Dreyfus, it seemed like the game was coming together, and it certainly had a promising future. The Lord of the Rings MMO, I know everyone hates Amazon games and they hate what happened with New World, and I totally agree. Like, list your grievances and I would probably say yes to all of them. Nevertheless, they did create some immersive, interesting spaces in New World, and there were things about New World that I enjoyed. Although it didn't all come together in the end for the perfect MMO package, there was certainly a fan base, there were people who loved that game, and there were things about that game that I loved. So I would have loved to see them take learnings from that and work on the next project, and with the visuals and the immersive nature of New World, like sideboarding that into a Lord of the Rings world and ideally improved upon, that would have been great as well. And Blackbird, dude, literally, it's like my dream to get a third-person shooter that's actually a full-blown open-world MMO. It's something that I want so desperately someone to do properly, and it's not really been fulfilled. There's been glimpses of that. I actually think Dune Awakening is like close to it, but not enough because it's so sandboxy, and the Haga Basin, which is where a bulk of the PvE content is so limited in scope when it comes to the number of players. If we can keep pushing in that direction and get closer and closer to a third-person looter shooter with fantasy RPG classes and skill trees and systems that's also in a big open world. Basically what Project Blackbird was. Basically how they describe Project Blackbird. That is the dream that I have for a third-person looter shooter MMO. So it freaking sucks that this shit's getting canceled nonstop. It's really unbelievable. And I will just echo the quotes that I just read from Emirates. There is a clear desire for a Western MMORPG. I love a lot of my games out of the East, you know what I mean? But there's also, with the MMO genre in particular, there's so much bloat and unnecessary systems and tracking, and not even bringing up the monetization and the gacha stuff. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if we're ever going to see it, but I will say this, there are still plenty of other MMOs I'm looking forward to on the horizon. I will for certain be putting together another list for 2026. It'll come at some point here, but it's also pretty clear, as if it hasn't been already over the past decade, that when it comes to new MMOs in the genre, and specifically new MMOs from Western studios, we're in a really rough spot. It's not looking great. Now, I will add, I get it. There's a lot of existing games in the genre that are great to play, and I do. Like, I'll revisit most of my favorite MMOs from time to time, a couple times a year, but there's nevertheless a strong desire and wanting for new games in the genre. Like, I don't want to just be revisiting the past all the time, even if it's for updates for those games. I like experiencing evolutions and improvements to things in the world of gaming, and I just wish we had more opportunities as fans of MMOs. I wish we had more opportunities for new evolutions and improvements to the genre, but there's just so few and far between, especially now with 4 of the ones that I was genuinely looking forward to canceled over just the past few months. Dude, this has been 2025 has been a killer year for in-production MMOs. I can't actually believe the headline that four of them canceled in 1 year. Really sucks, dude. Genuinely really does. That's all for today, though. I'd love to hear your thoughts as always below. Let me know what you think about this topic. Any of those games where you're really looking forward to, doesn't matter because we're not getting them. They will forever live in my head canon of what could have been. But that's all for today. Thanks as always for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you later.